and welcome. Welcome to the 2022 Henry George Seminar. For those of you who don't know me or recognize me, my name is John Ruddy. I'm an associate professor of finance in the economics and finance department here at the university. I'm also a 1991 alum. It is my great pleasure and honor today to introduce our 2022 speaker and guest here on campus today. But before I introduce our speaker, please indulge me for just a brief moment. I'd like to give you some backdrop. I think everyone here probably knows the expression, the third time's the charm, or better late than never. So I originally emailed our guest 3 years ago, believe it or not. And I actually went through my sent items and counted the number of emails that I pestered our poor guest with. So we actually had initial plans for him to visit our campus in April of 2020, not knowing, of course, that a global pandemic was about to ensue. So back and forth we went, and again, I pestered our poor guest with email after email. So as thrilled as I am to have the talk here today, the seminar, I'm sure he's thrilled to no longer receive my emails. So, but the number of emails are important because it actually, our guest and I were speaking probably 15, 20 minutes ago, and we're discussing about how many textbooks and books he has either co-authored or authored in the area of economics. And he was saying this is his fourth sole author textbook. So imagine how hard it is to read a textbook. He has written 4 of them, all while being a professor at one of our nation's finest academic institutions, the New York University, NYU for short. So he has published in the areas of game theory, microeconomics, and the theory of economic institutions. As you can see on the slide behind me, today he's going to speak to us about social learning. So please join me in giving a warm Scranton welcome to our guest here today, Dr. Andrew Schotter.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Sure. Let me. Don't worry, I'll get this in my pocket. Okay, great. Thank you, John. Thanks for your introduction, and I'm delighted to be here. It's taken 3 years for me to do so, but it's well worth it. I'm also honored to be invited to talk at this lecture series, which has had so many distinguished people talk before me. So it's a very impressive list. Also, I'm honored to speak in a seminar named for Henry George, whose work has lots of resonance in the world today. The problems that he was interested in obviously still exist today. They haven't been solved. His solutions still resonate. I'm also impressed to speak in a seminar dedicated to him because he almost was the mayor of New York, which was something interesting. And also, his book, Progress and Poverty, in the 1890s was the second seller to the only book that beat it out was the Bible. So that's pretty impressive. So what I want to talk today about is the question of social learning and the evolution of conventions of behavior. And so the question is, how do conventions of behavior or culture get created and passed down from generation to generation? And let me start out with a definition which will organize my thoughts. So here's a definition. 2 different societies have different cultures if they evolve different conventions of behavior to deal with the same set of common societal problems that they face. So you might ask what that means, so let me explain. There are 2 operational words here. One is conventions and one are societal problems. So let me explain those individually. So the idea here is that as societies develop, any societies, they all have a set of problems that they have to solve if they're going to actually function in an efficient way. So these problems are ones that you're all familiar with. Societies have to decide what religion to adhere to. Now, of course, they don't have to choose to have a religion, but if you look across societies, they all do. Okay? So one question is, what religion should they adhere to? Another one is, what commodity might they use for a medium of exchange? Because as you know, before we have fiat currency printed by the government, in ancient days, people used a variety of commodities in exchange. So that's something they have to settle on, what commodity they want to use. What side of the road to drive on? Either the right side, as we do in the United States, or the wrong side, the way they do in England. Okay? How to arrange money lending, how different genders are going to be treated, how inheritance will be determined. And then, as you know, there are several ways in which inheritance can be passed down. Ones used to be called primogeniture, which existed for a long time in England, where where inheritance went to the oldest male child. Okay? And if you were the second oldest, you got nothing. And if you were a woman, then they would look down the list, and if there wasn't a male down below, they would have to give it to the woman, but they were reluctant to do so. There's ultimogeniture, which is where the youngest person inherits the fortune. Okay? You have to decide how dowries will be paid, how wars will be fought. All societies face these problems. Okay? And those societies that develop an efficient set of solutions for them are the ones that are going to succeed. And those that don't are the ones that are likely going to fail. Now, if you take a look at this problem here, this situation here, obviously this is a society where they need a good convention of behavior to determine how they're going to deal with traffic when there's four corners at an intersection without any stop signs. And as you can see, this group of people didn't quite solve the problem in a very efficient way. Okay? Now, there's another interesting thing about doing these, congrading these conventions, and that is that they're complementary to each other, or they interact. So, for example, if in the set of problems that you're looking at, you're a society that happens to choose Islam as your religion, that's going to affect the type of banking system that you have, because in Islamic banking, you can't charge interest. Okay? Likewise, if you choose primogeniture as the way that inheritance gets treated, then you're going to affect the marriage market, because if you ever have read any Jane Austen novels, you know that the central feature of the Jane Austen novels is how are these women who are not the firstborn male going to survive without marrying a husband who has some money through inheritance. Okay? So Jane Austen novels are filled with the problem of you don't marry for money, you marry for money. Okay? And if anybody's watching The Gilded Age, which is on TV now, that's the problem. That's a constant one at the moment. Okay? Now, so conventions are the agreed-upon solution to these societal problems. And the definition of conventions that I'm going to be using is one that was created by a philosopher called David Lewis in a book in 1969. And the interesting thing about conventions is that they solve these basically coordination problems once and for all. And once they're solved, you don't have to re-solve them every time you go out on the street. So, okay. Now, in what I'm going to be discussing, I'm going to be using the word games a lot. And what I mean by a game is simply something of a multi-person decision problem where the actions of one person affects the payoffs of everybody else, including themselves. So in other words, it's a situation where everybody's fates are interconnected through their actions, but they don't all share the same preferences for the outcome. So their interests can conflict, okay? So it's a multi-person decision problem where people have perhaps conflicting interests. Okay, so let me give you a concrete example of what I'm talking about, and then this will furnish the example for what I'll talk about a little bit later on. This is a true story, supposedly. In Oberlin, in Ohio, a long time ago, when the telephone was first created, there was only one telephone line in Oberlin, Ohio. Okay? So what you would do if you wanted to call somebody is you would get on the phone, maybe crank it up in the old days. You get an operator, and you'd say to the operator, I want to call John. And the operator would take her thing and connect you and John through the switchboard, and then you could talk. But since there was only one line in Oberlin, Ohio, it had to be rationed, because if you're talking to John for 3 hours, nobody else in the town can call. So they had a rule that said after 3 minutes, the phone is going to be cut off. Your conversation is going to be ended. You better finish whatever you want to say in 3 minutes. Now, if you don't finish in 3 minutes, then you face a problem. And the problem looks like this. You can either have a strategy where you wait for for John to call you back, or you call John back. And he has the same problem. The line has been cut off. He can call you back, or he can wait. And let's make the assumption, just to make things easy, that you'd prefer to wait rather than call back. Why? Because maybe you have to pay for the phone call, and you're cheap, okay? So what this matrix tells you is that this is me and this is John. And if I wait and John calls back, then I get a payoff of 150, and John gets a payoff of 50. The numbers don't matter. All that matters is that 150 is greater than 50. If I call back and John waits, then the numbers are reversed. Okay, it's better for John that I'm calling him back, and he's waiting. However, if we both wait for the other person to call us back, then we're both sitting by a phone staring at it and it doesn't ring. Okay? Or if we both try to call each other back, then let's assume you get a busy signal, and that's not good. So you have to coordinate. You have to have a convention of behavior for this problem that tells you what to do when you've called somebody or when they've called you and the operator has cut you off. What rule should you follow? That's a societal problem that needs a convention of behavior to settle it. Okay? Now, note that a convention of behavior, in order for it to exist, it must be common knowledge. Okay? That means that everybody must believe that it exists. They think that others believe that it exists. That's what you call a second-order belief. They believe that others believe that others believe that it exists. That's a third-order belief, okay? Ad infinitum, actually. But the important point is that everybody knows it's there. Everybody believes everybody else is going to adhere to it, and therefore you adhere to it. These beliefs are what I'm going to define or call norms, and the conventions are the actions that you take given the beliefs that people have, or given the norms that they've established. Okay? So if you've noticed, when you go to an intersection and you want to cross the street, there's a stoplight there, and of course it has red and green. Let's say down the road some car is coming at you at 50 miles an hour, but the light turns green, you walk in the intersection. Now, why do you walk in the intersection? Well, you believe that there's a convention of behavior that when the light turns green, you should be able to walk, but you also have to believe that the other guy knows the convention, and when the light is red for him, he's going to stop, okay? If that ain't going to happen, then somebody's going to get hurt. But notice, I think we all know, at least I do, when that light turns green, I walk, okay? I don't wait for the guy to stop. And I walk because I have the faith that the person's going to stop. Now, these guys here are walking across the street, not worrying if another car is coming. Anybody know who these people are, by the way? Okay, yeah. This is the cover of Abbey Road, the Beatles thing. But, so obviously, they think that they're not in danger in crossing the road. Of course, nobody hits billionaires when they walk across the street. Okay. Now, the problems that I've described to you are what you could call naturally occurring problems. These are problems that just arise spontaneously because, you know, we get in our horse and buggy and we have to decide what side of the street to ride on. Those are naturally occurring problems. However, there are other problems that are not, well, they're not spontaneous, they're kind of man-created problems that need a convention to solve. And these are what's called in economics, economic mechanisms or institutions. These are schemes that are developed to help people solve problems which they might or otherwise have a problem solving, okay, which are difficult to solve. And I'm going to give an example of one of these problems by talking about school matching problems in Boston and in other cities where there was a difficulty arose about how to match students with schools. They developed a mechanism to do it, and then that created a game for people to play, and that created a situation where they needed a convention of behavior to solve that. But I'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so the question is, how are conventions, once created to solve a societal problem, passed down from generation to the next generation? Okay. And my answer is that this occurs through a process of what's called social learning, where conventions of behavior are passed down from generation to generation through the process of what's called intergenerational advice. Okay? So parents give advice to their children, children give advice to their children, and this gets passed on from generation to generation. Okay? And that creates something that's called an intergenerational game, because given that it's a game, the payoffs and fortunes of people are determined not only by what they choose during their generation of their life, but also what their children and perhaps grandchildren are going to do. I'll explain this more carefully in a minute. Okay? Now, the work that I do has evolved over the years, but now it's mostly experimental. So what does that mean? It means that if I have a theory that I want to test, or I have some correlate of behavior that I'm interested in looking at, I bring people into a lab, okay? And by people, I usually mean college undergraduates, typically at NYU. I create a decision problem for them, or a game which is isomorphic or very similar to the problem that I'm interested in studying. The theory provides predictions for what should happen, and then I test if these subjects in the lab behave according to the theory or present behavior that deviates from the theory and therefore needs to be explained. Okay? And that's what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my talk, talking about experiments that I've done to test how conventions are passed down in the lab, let's say, and ask maybe we can generalize outside of the lab, and doing that through this apparatus of an intergenerational game. Okay? So what are intergenerational games? Well, think of the competition between two car companies, GM and Toyota, or between two countries, the US and Russia. Now, you can think of the game that they're playing, the GM-Toyota game or the US-Russia game, as a game that has an infinite life, that there will always be a Toyota and a GM, okay? And there'll always be a US and Russia, okay? And they'll always be playing a game, but the thing that's not infinite is the lives of the people who are playing those games. They have finite lives, okay? And they're going to retire one day, or they're going to get assassinated, okay? And when they do, well, not if they get assassinated. It would be hard to give advice to the next generation if you get assassinated. But when you retire, you're going to give advice to the person who takes your place, okay? And what are you going to tell them when they take your place? Well, you're going to tell them basically the conventions of behavior and the norms of behavior that you've established during your existence playing this game, and you're going to give them that advice. Now, we know when presidents transition in the United States, there's this tradition in the Oval Office that one president leaves a little letter for the next president. So Bush left a nice letter for Obama. Obama left a nice letter for Trump. I don't know what Trump's letter was like. I don't know if he left a letter. But that's a kind of idea that there's this kind of intergenerational game being played. Okay. Now, let's assume that time is divided into generations, and let's say that each generation lasts K periods. So two CEOs come in, they interact for K periods, and then they retire, and when they retire, they pass on advice to the next generation of CEOs that take their place, and then they play the game for another K periods. And we're going to assume, however, that people care about the next generation in the sense that the payoff of subjects in our experiments are going to be equal to the money that they earn. Oh, by the way, in these experiments, everybody earns money. There's games with payoffs, and everybody earns money. They leave the lab after an hour and a half with about $30 to their name. But it depends on the decisions that they make, okay? And the payoffs to people in these intergenerational games is equal to the payoff that they get during their lifetime plus 1/2 of what their children get. Okay? Now, they don't care about their grandchildren in the experiments that we do, but their payoff is equal to the payoff during their lifetime plus 1/2 of what their children get, which gives them an incentive to give advice to the next generation that's meaningful because they're going to share whatever profits they make. Okay? So that's how generations are connected to each other. That's why there's kind of intergenerational caring, because when I give advice, I have a vested interest in what you do, okay? So when generations arrive in this game, they get advice from their predecessors. When generations retire, okay, they send advice to their successor, and I said they get 1/2 of what the next generation gets. So there's intergenerational caring. When a generation arrives, they get advice from their predecessors. They know their opponents have received advice as well, but they don't know what advice their opponents have gotten. They just know that they got advice, okay? They observe all part of the history of the game they're entering. So in these experiments, some people come in, get advice, and can see everything that's happened before in the history of this game or interaction. Some people only get advice, and in other treatments, people can only get history and no advice, okay? So those are 3 different treatments, okay? And then they choose an action, get a payoff, and give advice to the next generation. So this is how the game evolves. You have generation 1 comes in, they play for K periods, they give advice to generation 2, they play, they give advice to generation 3, and their fates are connected by the payoffs that they get, okay? So let's go back to this game, and let's play this in the lab, okay, over what's going to be 80 generations, okay? Just one thing about this, I want you to notice that when both players choose 2, okay, that's the best thing for the person who's choosing the column, right? Because they're getting 150 and the row chooser is getting 50. But when both players choose 1, that's better for the row chooser. So the column, the outcome that's best for the column choosers is the 2-2 outcome. Both players choose strategy 2. The one that's best for the row player is the 1-1 outcome, okay? And there's, of course, the 1-2 outcome, where everybody gets 0, or the 2-1 outcome, where everybody also gets 0, okay? So here's the experiment. Subjects are ordered into generations. Each generation lives for T periods. There's 80 generations. Each generation can view the entire previous history. They get advice. We elicited beliefs about what each generation thought their opponent was going to do, and those are the norms, but I'm not going to be talking about them. And the payoffs that people get is the payoff during their lifetime plus 1/2 of the next generation's payoff, okay? So that's what I've just described. These are the 3 treatments, and let's look at the results. Okay, so what do I have here? This is a diagram where here it's generations. So remember, everybody plays this game once. So you come in, another person comes in, you play, you're the row chooser, they're the column chooser, you get a payoff, you give advice to the next generation, you leave, they come in, they play, and it goes on like that, okay? So these are the generations. I only have 25 generations here, but I'll extend it to 80 generations soon. And these are the outcomes of their interaction. So it could be row 1 chooses 1, column chooses 1, row chooses 2, column chooses 2, and then the mixed outcomes, okay? And those are the payoffs that I've described to you before, okay? So I want to show what happens over time when I play this in the lab with subjects who are earning money for their playing, okay? They start out at 1-2, which means that before anything happens, each player goes for that payoff which is best for him. The row player chooses 1, looking for the 150. The column player chooses 2, looking for 150, and they end up with 0. So both people are trying to be greedy in the beginning, and it turns out that it doesn't work for them. What do they do next period? They do it again. What do they do next period? They do it again. So everybody's being greedy. They want the 150 for themselves. That goes on for 3 periods. Now, that could go on forever, perhaps, but it's not an equilibrium thing to happen. Then, all of a sudden, we get the 2-2 outcome. Now, that's the outcome that's best for the column. So the column player is very happy. The row player is kind of happy because they're getting 50, which is better than 0, but they might be a little ticked off that the column player is getting their best outcome. Now, let's see what happens. These are all new generations. Well, okay. For 12 periods in a row, both players choose 2. Now, that's the outcome that's best for the column player. And the row player is acceding to that because they are. So the row player is getting 50, the column player is getting 150. That's gone on for 13 periods. Now the question is, maybe that should go on forever. Maybe that's it. That's the convention. It'll never get broken apart. And there's a good reason why it should never disintegrate. And that is, we know the column player doesn't want to deviate because he's getting 150. And what would happen if the row player decided not to cooperate here and choose something else? Well, the row player, if they deviated, they get 0 in this period. And the best possible thing that could ever happen to them next period is that their deviation convinced the other guy to go up to 1-1 and they get 150, but they only get half of that. So their payoff would be 50 plus, and their payoff would be 0 plus 1/2 of 150. And now what are they getting? They're getting 50 plus 1/2 of 50. It's 75 in both cases. So they don't have any positive incentive to want to deviate. Okay, now, that's logically what the case that they shouldn't deviate. Okay, that's what a game theorist would say. This should go on forever. What are they being told? Because remember, these people are getting advice. Okay, these people are getting advice. What are they being told? Well, basically, they're being told not to deviate. This is the advice that the role player is getting. Okay, so let's take a look. This is when you give advice in this game, you tell them what strategy to choose, and then you're free to write any essay to describe your thinking about the strategy that you're offering. Okay? So this guy says choose 2, and then he says chances are that your opponent will choose the column where he would get the highest payoff. Okay? The next guy says your opponent is going to choose the column with the highest payoff for themselves. So these people are beginning, this is early on, these are the advice before the 13th period. Okay? So everybody seems to understand that the other guy is likely to be greedy. Here's an elaborate one. It says, both previous advice and previous trends indicate that the pair 2-2 is always chosen. If you look at history, the pair 2-2 appears everywhere. Your opponent will know that and won't break the trend by choosing column 2, which is more profitable for him anyway. Stick with row 2 if you wish to make any money. If you want to try to shift the balance to row 1, which is better for us row choosers, take row 1, but be warned that you'll probably wind up with nothing. Okay? Everybody is telling these people, stick with the 2-2 convention. The same goes here. Okay? These are common things. Here, this one you're going to see again in a second. It says, the history shows that I found people are greedy, so you better choose 2 or you'll be left with nothing. That's the advice. Okay? Now, this advice looks pretty good in this. If you're an experimenter, you'll like this because it demonstrates that the kids who are doing this experiment understand the trade-offs in the problem that they're facing, right? And that's good for you because the advice is actually very helpful to at least be a reality check that the subjects understand the problem. But not all student subjects are this thoughtful. One guy later on in the game says, I really don't give a damn. The person before said 1 and I lost big. Well, who gives a rat's ass anyways? There's really no advice I can give. Look at it this way. Either the other one thinks the other is greedy or the other one learns from before and messes it up. So advice like that And sometimes people say, be cool, dude, do the cool thing, okay? And that advice isn't very informative. But the advice I've been talking to you about up until now is very precise, very sophisticated, very correct. And it seems as if, for all sorts of reasons, behavior should just go on at the 2-2 equilibrium forever, okay? What happens next? That's what happened next. Both people deviate in period 14, okay? Spontaneously. And they deviate even though they were told not to deviate. Because this guy was told, the history shows that I found people greedy, so you better choose 2 or be left with nothing. And this guy says, definitely choose number 2. So it just spontaneously broke apart, okay? Now that it's broken apart, and both people are choosing 1, what do you think will happen next? Well, they go back up and choose 2. Even though here they were both told to stay with 1, okay? So, you know, what does this kind of demonstrate? It demonstrates, as I'll talk about later, is that these conventions can be fragile, and they can be fragile sometimes when the string of advice is not very informative, okay? What happens in the rest of the game, this is what happens in the rest of the game. We're over here. These are the periods that I've just told you about. And then once this breaks up, they go back there. Then it breaks up again. Notice they keep on returning to 2-2. Okay? Then in periods 25 through 43, things are different, but they're choosing the 1-1 convention much more often here. They only chose it twice here, but here they're choosing the 1-1 convention. Here it's kind of just garbage, but here they return to the 2-2 equilibrium. In the theory of social evolution, this is kind of called what's called punctuated equilibria, where you get equilibrium behavior for a certain amount of time, and then it disintegrates and gets messed up, but then reemerges back later in not so neat a way, but still a more sophisticated way. Okay, so what's the summary? So social conventions could be established. They get passed down from generation to generation, but they can also be disrupted. Okay, that's part of the punchline. Now, I told you we did 3 different treatments in this experiment. One, which I've just showed you, is where people can get advice and see all the history of the game up until when they choose. One, where they could get advice, but they couldn't see any history. And one where they could see history and get no advice. Okay? And then the question is, where do you think the outcome would be most efficient? In other words, would people be better off, would they coordinate more in those treatments where they have advice, or would they be better off just letting history be their guide as to what they're going to do? Okay, that's the question. And here are the results. It turns out that the treatment that I showed you, advice plus history, is the most efficient in the sense that people coordinate 47 out of 81 times, 58% of the time. They coordinate either on 1-1 or 2-2. Okay? In the advice with no history, subjects coordinate 39 out of 80 times, which is only 47%. But the worst thing that happens is when you don't have advice and they only have history. Because when they only have history, they only coordinate 19 out of 66 times, or 29%, okay? Which means that whatever is being talked about across generations seems to be helping people coordinate for some mysterious reason, actually. But one thing that also emerges from this is that people are not great in analyzing just a time series of economic choices, okay? Just sequences of historical choices. They possibly might need some advice to help them make some sense out of them. Okay. So the punchline here is advice is beneficial for coordination. Its efficiency increasing. Advice plus history is the most beneficial. If you take advice away and have people rely on history, they do badly. and people do not learn necessarily the lessons from the past. Okay? Now, as I mentioned before, the situations that require a convention can be either natural ones that are just spontaneously occurring, or they can be man-made. Okay? And what I mean is that sometimes governments or organizations have to create mechanisms or institutions or schemes that people will use to help them solve a problem that they couldn't necessarily solve by themselves. So what is this all about? Well, one of the problems that I'm going to talk about is school matching. So let me talk about that for a second. The school matching problem, which is an area that lots of economists have been interested in because it's an example of what's called mechanism design, where you design an institution for people to use to help them solve a problem that they're interested in. And the problem here is the problem of matching students with schools. And the problem was created in Boston because school matching grew out of the 1974 court decision that ordered busing for racial balance in Boston. Okay? So the Boston school system was fairly segregated. Case was brought. The court listened to the case, and the compromise, or the result, was that they instituted busing, which was something to solve the problem of segregated schools. So they would bus children across school districts. Okay? That was not very popular, and in 1987, the U.S. Court of Appeals freed the Boston Public Schools to adopt what's called the choice-based assignment plan. So the idea here is that, look, we're not going to bus kids from one part of the city to the other, but we're going to let kids, wherever they live, choose which school they want to go to, okay? And that way, you know, wherever I live in the city, if I want to go to a school on the other end of the city, I can apply to go there. And there'll be some algorithm that will match the students with the schools, okay? And that created this need for creating a school matching algorithm or a school matching mechanism that was good, that people liked, okay? So that was the background for the school matching problem, okay? So these are schools, these are children, okay? And the way it works is the following. You give instructions to the parents. Obviously, the parents are going to make these choices. You give instructions to the parents about how the mechanism works. And the input from the parents into the mechanism is they have to rank schools for their kids. So you say, this is my kid's first best, my kid's second best, my kid's third best. Every parent submits a ranking, okay? When the ranking is taken by the administrators, it's put into an algorithm, and which matches students with schools, and they want to design a mechanism that has, well, many good properties, but two properties in particular, which are that they want to have a mechanism that motivates parents to submit their truthful preferences. They don't want parents to submit strategic preferences. You know, they want them to submit what they truly, how much they truly prefer these schools, basically because they want the truthful information in order to match people. And the second thing that they want to do is determine matches that are what are called stable. So in other words, you want to have a matching which is such that when it's over, there exists no student who would rather be in a school other than the one that he or she was matched with, and no school that would rather have that student in them rather than one that they've accepted. So those are the two properties that they wanted from a school matching mechanism. Okay? Now, how does it work? Parents submit their rankings, and schools have to admit students based on certain priorities. Okay? And if a student doesn't have a priority, then they just compete with other students without priorities. And these priorities might be that if you live in the district, you get priority for that school. Okay? Or if your sibling goes to that school, you get priority. Okay? Or other things. Okay? And the benefit from having priority is that if there are 3 seats in a school and 4 people who apply, then the person with priority can kick out somebody without priority. That's the way this is going to work. Okay. Now, there's a mechanism that became very popular called the Gale-Shapley matching mechanism, which has those 2 properties. And it works as follows. Each parent proposes her first best school listed on her submitted rankings. So in other words, in round 1, the administrator looks at the rankings and submits everybody's first choice to the school that they've dedicated as their first choice. In step 2, each school retains the applicants with the highest priorities and rejects all the other applicants. Okay? In step 3, whenever a parent is rejected by a school, she applies to the next highest school on their ranking. Okay? Step 4, whenever a school receives new applicants, okay, these applications are considered together with the ones that were previously retained, if any. Among the retained and the new applicants, the subject with the highest priority is retained and all other applicants are rejected. And then this is repeated until everybody is matched with a school, which will happen under the algorithm. Okay? So that's how it works. And the properties of this mechanism is that it's the best thing that a parent can do is to submit their truthful rankings. Don't try to strategize. And the algorithm determines a stable match if everybody submits truthfully. Okay? That's what we're looking for here. Okay. So we did an experiment on this matching mechanism. And what we wanted to find out was, does it work? Okay? Do people submit truthfully? Okay? And what happens to their behavior over time as they repeat doing this? So how do we do this? Well, we give people 3 schools, A, B, and C, and we tell them that you have a first, second, and third best school. And if you get matched with your first best school, we're going to give you $24. If you get matched with your second best school, we're going to give you $16. And if you get matched with your third best school, we're going to give you $8. Those are your incentives. And given those incentives, you have to submit a ranking for the schools that exist, or for the slots that exist in the experiment. And we did 2 treatments. One treatment is where we bring people in, we have them play this game 20 times with themselves, with the group of 5 people, okay? Another treatment is where is an intergenerational treatment with social learning, where there are 20 generations. Each generation plays it once and gives advice to the next generation about what they should submit, okay? And we want to compare the behavior of generations with the behavior of people who are playing this game repeatedly and getting a lot of experience with it, okay? And we want to see, does that make a difference? And does the fact that there's generations with advice help this mechanism, or does it hurt the performance of people in the mechanism? So these are the questions that we want to discuss. And these are the results. So what do we see here? In the blue line, these are periods 1 through 5, 6 through 10, 11 through 15, 16 through 20. The blue line is the fraction. Oh, let me state one thing. When you run this mechanism in the real world, all parents are told it is in your best interest to report your preferences truthfully. Everybody's told that. As a matter of fact, this is the same mechanism that's used to match medical interns with medical schools. That's been going on for 25 or 30 years. And in the matching of medical interns to medical schools, every medical intern is told, submit truthfully, okay? Turns out that in the medical intern case, 25% of people don't submit truthfully, okay? They think that they can do better by doing something else, okay? So here, what we have are time periods here and the fraction of people telling the truth, because that's the dominant thing that they can do here. They're supposed to tell the truth. And it turns out that when you repeat this by people and they can learn the mechanism, the fraction of truth-telling goes up over time, and more people tell the truth. But when you have generations, over time, people start to strategize. And by strategize, what they do is they put, if they have priority for their second school, they put their second school first rather than putting their first school first. The idea being is, look, I have priority for that school. I'll get $16 if I get it. I might as well do that rather than maybe risk, being closed out of that and getting something worse. That turns out to be not the correct logic, but that's what people think that they should do. Okay? So, behavior diverges across these two treatments. When people learn by themselves and repeat it for 20 periods, they tell the truth more and more often, but with advice they don't. So the question is, what's responsible for this decline in truth-telling? Okay? Why did it go in the opposite direction? And the idea, again, is that advice, although it was somewhat efficiency enhancing in the first experiment that I talk about, can also be deleterious to good outcomes if the wrong advice is passed on from generation to generation. So, this is the advice given by a type 1 agent only. This agent, or this subject, has two properties. First, school C is their best, school A is their second best, school B is their third best, and they have priority for school A. So if they submit to school A, they will definitely get school A. That's a safe thing for them to do. But they don't lose anything by submitting C first, okay, for reasons I can explain. But it's a dominant strategy for them to submit C first. So what is the advice? Well, what do we have here? This is the strategy that the people actually used, and this is what they were told to do. Now, strategy 1 is truth-telling. Forget about strategy 2. Strategy 1 is truth-telling, and strategy 3 is the strategic, both advice and behavior. So if they choose strategy 3, they're strategizing. If they choose strategy 1, they're telling the truth. And what do we see? Well, things start out, and the interesting thing is how people repeat the advice from their predecessor. So these people all start out strategizing. They say, in my opinion, choose priority first. Then the next guy says, choose priority first so that you can definitely get 16. By choosing this order, you guarantee that you will get 16. This guarantees getting 16. One thing that's interesting is that the words of the advice just seem to pass on like some kind of a meme that gets, passed on from generation to generation. That gets broken here, and then all of a sudden people start to tell the truth. They say, make sure C is your first choice. You are guaranteed a maximum payoff. C is the maximum payoff and no priority. C has the maximum payoff. C has more EDU, which is experimental currency units, and no priority. So all of a sudden everybody's telling everybody to tell the truth. But then that breaks down here all of a sudden. And then the advice, here people end up choosing 3, which is the strategizing thing. So what's the punchline? So the punchline is that, that intergenerational advice can mess up what the mechanism designer wanted to happen, okay? They wanted everybody to tell the truth. People were told, in many instances, to tell the truth, but they thought they could strategize, and not only did they think they could strategize, but they also told their next generation that they should strategize, and things went in the wrong direction. Is that a hint? Okay. I'm finished, by the way, so just take me a second. Okay. So this advice, which is the wrong advice, can be passed down from generation to generation and ruin the sought-after outcomes. And the idea is that once you design one of these mechanisms, you just can't leave it alone. You have to constantly monitor it to see how people are using it. And if they're using it in an inappropriate way or in a way that's actually worse for them, then you might have to consistently intervene and try to correct the behavior that this advice is giving. Okay, so I'm going to finish up. And just say that, as I hope you could see, my aim here was to discuss the evolution of conventions of behavior. I did this by investigating experiments which I called intergenerational games. What we've seen is that conventions are rules of behavior that are handed down over time from generation to generation, but their path is uncertain because advice can be random and people may not always follow advice. Okay? As a result, societal behavior can be volatile and differences in cultures can occur when the same games are played intergenerationally across different societies. So the last point is that when you look across different cultures or different societies, there's lots of scope here for people who face the same problem to develop different conventions of behavior to solve those same problems, because nobody has control over the advice that's given intergenerationally, okay? And therefore, you know, Germans may act like Germans and Americans may act like Americans, but it's all possibly a function of the fact that we face the same problems, but we've decided to solve them differently and socialize our children into behaving the way we behaved. That's it. I think if anybody wants to ask questions, there's an opportunity for that. Right there.
Hello. First of all, thank you for this amazing lecture. I am a mathematics major with a finance minor. So my name is Ax, by the way. So I have a question regarding your the first game in which you had that, suppose the first person chooses, both of them choose 1-1, then the ratio is 3:1, and suppose they choose 2-2, the ratio is 1:3.
Yeah.
And from what you've said is that both of them don't know what to choose, so they're unaware of what the other person is making the choice. Now, would it affect if each other knows what they're choosing? Would that affect the game in which the outcomes are determined?
So one thing I didn't define for that game is what an equilibrium is. So an equilibrium is a situation where I believe that you're going to choose strategy 2, okay? You believe that I'm going to choose strategy 2. And given those beliefs, it's best for us to actually choose strategy 2 because we have no incentive to deviate, okay? So an equilibrium for such a situation is a pair of beliefs. You can think of it as a pair of beliefs, which I would call the norms here, where I believe with some high probability that you're going to choose strategy 2. You believe with some high probability that I'm going to choose strategy 2. And given those beliefs, it's a best response for us, or the best thing that we can do is actually choose strategy 2. So our behavior confirms our beliefs. So we actually do choose 2 for each other because we all believe that the other one's going to be choosing that way, okay? So I think that's, so you said if I knew, all I've done in your question is replace belief with if I knew that the other person was going to choose that. And of course, the belief has to be high enough. Anybody else?
Yeah, this is also the Oberlin call.
Okay.
Because they can see the history, they should be able to figure out that alternating is going to have the best payoff for each. So once you got in, I thought you had a little cycle there, but it didn't continue, which surprised me.
Okay, so that's a good point. In the experiment that I did, every generation plays once. What would happen if every generation played 10 times and then was replaced by somebody else, okay? Now, we've done that once or twice, just for curiosity, and what happens is exactly what you say, that they alternate. Now, what does alternating do? Well, it's efficient, but it also equalizes the payoffs between the 150 and the 50, okay? So it's true that if we let them have more experience, they would have alternated, okay? The problem was that when they give advice to the next generation, their advice is alternate, but they don't tell them what to start with. So in the beginning of a new generation, it's very messy, and then they figure it out, and they alternate. So alternating is a convention that could have been established, you know. And however, an alternating convention with a telephone thing, what you'd have to remember, was it me who called that person up the last time, or did they call me up? And, you know, it can get messy, okay? So it might be better just to have a rule rather than alternate. But that's a good point, yeah.
So my follow-up question is, so the first scenario that you described, it had only two factors. How is it gonna affect if you have like multi-factors? Because like when you look at it in terms of the mathematical point of view, you could have multiple dimensions that affect this game. And so for now, you just have two people who don't know what's going on. What if you had a third person? What if you had a fourth person?
Yeah.
How would those dynamics change?
Well, I don't know how they would change, but the definition of what equilibrium, things wouldn't change too much. It's just that you would have to define a convention in what I'm talking about is what's called an equilibrium for the game that the people are playing. So if there's n people in the game, the definition is the same. Everybody have beliefs about what everybody else is doing, such that given their beliefs about what other people are doing, they have an incentive to take an action that self-fulfills the beliefs. So you can do it with n, you can do it with a continuum of people, actually, if you want. Everything would stay the same, but of course, it's much harder in a large society to create a convention than in just two people in a lab. Yeah.
I guess my question is related to culture, because you talk about how culture is important, right? So
altruism?
Culture, the culture.
Oh, culture.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the culture is important, but are you assuming here that each generation is within the same culture, or because different cultures can exist within the same society as well?
Yeah. Yeah. So. So of course, one way to ask what you're saying is, not with these games necessarily, but what would happen if I took this game, played it in different countries, okay? Would the things that they select, the strategies they select, look different, you know? Now that could be, in other words, there could be a cultural thing. For example, I don't know, in this game that I gave you, everything was symmetric, so I don't know if some societies, but there might be things that pop out at people who live in certain cultures that don't pop out in situations that people live in other cultures, and that may be salient, and that may be something that they decide to coordinate on and use to create a convention. Here, a convention is just, so as I said in the beginning, culture, so these students all have the same, quote, culture, but used in the general sense. In the sense of culture here, it simply means a group of people who come upon a problem and solve it, multiple problems, solve it in similar ways or in different ways.
So maybe I'll follow up with a question following Jordan's question. Again, it's about culture. You mentioned this a little bit, but I'm just curious about the following question. Not sure whether you have an answer. Let's say for people from different cultures, following Hofstede's definition of culture, let's say one culture from individualism versus another one with collectivism. Right. So people in which culture are more likely to deviate in terms of this intergeneration games? I'm not sure whether you have the answer.
Individualistic culture, you're saying?
Yeah, individualism.
Yeah. No, so I think that's an issue that one deals with a lot in experimental economics, which is how externally valid are the results that you get when you do an experiment with 120 NYU undergraduates. Now, of course, NYU undergraduates come from many cultures, but you get the point. They're undergraduates with a certain socioeconomic background to them. So the question is, how well do those results travel to different places? Now, there's lots of experiments, and there's a famous book by a bunch of behavioral economists and anthropologists where they take various games, and they travel around the world to wide varieties of different cultures and play the same games and look for differences across these cultures, okay? One famous game that they do, which is the ultimatum game, where I have say I have $100, and I'm asked to split it with you, and I make a split. Maybe I keep 80 for myself and give you 20, and then your decision is to accept or reject. If you accept, then you get 20 and I keep 80. If you reject, if you accept, that's what happened. If you reject, we both get 0, okay? Now, the idea there is that if you're an economist and you're trained probably the way you're all supposed to be trained here, the idea is you give a penny. Why do you give a penny? Because a penny is greater than 0. And I only have a choice between a penny and 0, so I might as well take it. But people don't take a penny when you're offered to them because they get, to use a technical term, pissed off that the guy is keeping $99.99 and gave you a penny, so that gets retaken. Take that game across the world, and you'll see that it's played very differently. As a matter of fact, one interesting result is in some societies, they give the person more than 50% of the $100. They give them like 80%, and the people reject it. And the reason that they reject it is that in those societies, I think, if somebody gives you that kind of a gift, they expect something back in the future. And you don't want to get involved in that. So you just reject it so you're not in their debt, okay? Now that's a big cultural difference, okay? Nobody here is probably going to reject some maniac who gives you 80 cents, $80 out of 100. But if you take that game across different cultures. So there are definitely different cultures. All that I'm saying here is I'd be perfectly happy to find that the games that I did here with these particular students generated very different conventions of behavior than if I took the same game and brought it someplace else. That would be a good result for me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for a very great presentation. I'm not economist, I'm not very much familiar, but in marketing, usually we believe that economists are thinking very statically because they always consider there is no other conditions. Like if you go back to your first example, if I'm passing a cross line and the driver is coming, I suppose that he knows that he has to stop, and I will follow. What happens if he's drunk?
Right.
He knows that he has to stop, but he's drunk, isn't
Right.
he? My question is that if we want to formulate this game theory, do we have any place for the error terms, those things happens that somebody, is out of our control and not we can predict it?
Yeah. The answer is yes and no. I mean, game theory is a theory of equilibrium outcomes, okay? So there's no room in that, okay, for those kinds of stochastic mistakes or something like that. But one can certainly think, now that comes into the idea of these beliefs. So when I go to cross the street, I have several beliefs. I have a belief that the guy knows the light is red and he's supposed to stop. And I also probably have a belief that he's capable of stepping on the brake without making a mistake. Okay? So all of that is embedded in the belief that I have before I decide to step out in the street. It's not just the idea that he knows the convention. It's also the idea that he's competent enough to stop without killing me. Yeah.
So to go back to the first experiment you did in the lab, there was some early behavior in the first, I believe, 12 generations, and then it spiked, I think, in generation 13 or 14 in the early teens.
Right.
Is that always the case, or is there deviation? Like, did you run the simulation 100 times, or was that an average, or do they always seem to mirror each other pretty closely?
Okay, so one thing that you could say is a drawback of this experiment and, is that this is just one time series.
Okay.
This is just one path through history. Now, we would love to have done it 100 times, but remember, everybody plays just once in this game. So I've done this to get one path of length 80, you need 80 students. Now, if you want a nice sample of this path, you want to do it 100 times, you need 100 times 80 students, so that's not feasible. But I think the answer to your question is that if we did this again, and then again, and then again, we'd see many very different paths, okay? What I believe would be robust would be the fact that advice helped coordination. That's one thing I think that would translate across all of these different things. And I think that you'd also find that history was pretty bad. I don't think people are that great in learning lessons from just history presented to them as a time series of what's happened in the past. So those things I think would stay. But of course, I think you'd see lots of different paths. I don't think that's what you would see possibly ever again. Okay, but I think the other things would probably remain.
Thank you.
I was wondering if gender had any different payoff result. Like, I mean, male versus female get more receive advice better or give advice better.
Mm.
Yeah.
So you're talking about gender
Yeah.
differences. Yes. So that's a big thing in experiments. I mean, lots of people, when they do experiments, are interested in whether there are a variety of differences, but one that people concentrate on a lot is gender differences. So the answer to your question is I don't know, because we've never looked at that. However, that could be very interesting, okay? I mean, now, I have no a priori predictions, okay, and nor would I want to make any, okay? But it would be interesting to know if women, compared to men, don't follow advice more often, do follow advice more often, offer advice, to cooperate more, to concede. Remember, that game is about giving in to the other person. So or are they obstinate and just want the best for themselves? That I don't know. I mean, I don't even know if we have the identities for various human resource, for various security reasons to protect people's identity. I don't know exactly how we have it, and these were done a long time ago, but that would be something interesting to look at. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have one concern based on the experiment that you had, because the basic assumption in this experiment is that people want to gain something. Mm-hmm. And also there is a scenario that they don't gain anything, they lose everything. Mm-hmm. What happens if it's a combination of gain and lose? Mm-hmm. Imagine war happens, like if you look at the Ukraine war, at the beginning, US and Russia, they had some expectation. What happens if both sides want to have some gain, some loss? Is there any way in economics we can combine that gain and loss?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's just a matter of how you construct the way people make payoffs. So games can have, these are just, the simplest, but you can do any kinds of payoffs that you want. Yeah. Thank you.